Isaiah. In fact, I wrote a commentary on Isaiah. Now, Janet is one of my church members from Temple when I was pastor there. And as my wife and now my daughter is here visiting from Spokane. She came down. She's an ER nurse, so if any of you get sick, I know who to call. She's been doing it for a number of years. But this particular sermon gave me insights into really what it is to be ready for Christ's return in the last days. We cannot look at all of our sins and think that that's going to be the thing that's going to help us understand the judgment and the love of God. We need to consider the judgment, but the judgment is not the focus I don't think Isaiah has. The focus is what he introduces or what he brings about in chapters 5 and 6. So with that said, let's have one more prayer. Father, now as we turn to your word, we ask that you would be with us. I pray, dear Lord, for the insights that Isaiah had when he actually saw you in a vision. That we understand what that meant, Father, and what it means, truly, to see you and reflect on you from unclean lips to a holiness. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I've written out the introduction, by the way, if you want a copy of the sermon, but only 3 of you read it, so I don't know if I'm going to keep bringing them. But one, we'll have a copy to make for you. I'm going to leave him one. I can't stress enough, you study. I can't stress enough. We're seeing a meltdown of our nation as I've never seen. In my 77 years, I started picking up politics back when Vietnam, actually a little before Vietnam, when Vietnam took place, because it impacted my life. And so I see what the politicians are doing now, and yet if I just look at them, I'd be overwhelmed and discouraged. But when I look at the scriptures, I realize God has a master plan. Amen. And by studying the scriptures, we know the end from the beginning, don't we? Amen. And so with that, let me give you the introduction. I'm going to read through it fairly quickly. And then we're going to get into the Word. And we're going to break it down, try to understand it, grasp it, absorb it, that it can make a difference in who we are as Christians. Isaiah's name means Jehovah is salvation. Isaiah is prophesied during the reigns of Uzziah, known as Azariah. That's found in 2 Kings chapter 14. Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, who was absolutely the worst king. When we think of Ahaz and some of these others, Manasseh takes the lead there. And it was Manasseh who was in reign when Isaiah was killed. Isaiah was a prophet of righteousness, holiness, and justice. He was also a prophet of faith. Now, if I see any of you starting to drift off on me, I may ask you a question. Okay? I was kicked out of one church when I did that. No, but I want to make sure we're together. I cannot stress how important it is for us to understand the prophetic messages of these prophets in preparation of what we're facing in our nation and the world. He was also a prophet of faith, courage, and consecration, in other words, dedication. He felt worship, in order to be valid, had to be done in true humility and obedience. Humility and obedience for worship to be valid. He was not alone in his belief of outward formalities counted little. Sacrifices were worthless, and public worship of little significance, if not grounded in a purity of life and heart. Well, how do you get there? We're all sinners. Well, that's what he's going to discuss. That's what he's going to break down in chapter 5 and 6. We found other prophets like Micah, the prophet of justice, Hosea, the prophet of love, Elijah, a man of faith and courage, John the Baptist, fearless, denouncer of sin, John, teacher of true holiness, and James, a despair of spiritual laziness, or one who looks at hypocrisy and shame with contempt or scorn. I wrote a commentary on James. I never fully understand James until I broke it down and was able to understand what this whole concept of works as opposed to faith. And James brings that out. And so all of these prophets that I just mentioned had the same position and similar belief that Isaiah had. Isaiah just sort of incorporates these things. Isaiah lived in a time that called for courage as well as conviction, for action as well as faith. He was again against alliances of all kinds that were opposed to the will of God or a lack of faith in the Lord's leading. And we find in 2 Kings 19, he told Hezekiah, "Be not afraid." Can you say that in this day? It's hard. The other night I was picking up my daughter at the airport. She flew in from Spokane. And at the airport there's a lane that merges. They merge together, you know, and you get into the arrivals, the departures, and here in Austin, right? Have you ever been there? All of y'all been there? So you know how those lanes merge? Well, it's dark. I heard a flight came in at 9 o'clock at night. And so I'm drifting. I was trying to stay in my lane, but you had to sort of drift over. Well, there was a fellow that was in my blind spot, and I didn't pick him up. And I have these lights, or these mirrors, and you're supposed to be able to, with that little tiny mirror, pick the one right next to you. But for some reason, he wasn't there, even with his headlights on. He or she, I don't know who was in the car. So I'm pulling over because the sign says you got to get over, merge left or merge right, whatever it was. Well, I was merging over to the next lane. And all of a sudden I hear this horn, and I looked, and there in the very bottom of my mirror, I see this individual, and he or she swerving. I swerved back. That close to making contact, in which I did not want. Wow. And so I think, how quick, driving down here, you have an 80, 85 mile zone. There was somebody that passed us going 90 or 100, and all the lanes ahead had cars in them. And there was no place to go except off to the far right where there was an exit. And I thought, how quick could a life be snubbed out on a situation, somebody driving like that crazy? Well, the road signs are up. The road signs are up. God has given us indications that He's coming back. Amen. But are you aware of the indications? Do you know all the things that He's told you that is going to happen in preparing you for meeting your Lord? And so Isaiah wants us, he said, be not afraid. The Lord could only help if people would turn to Him with a heartfelt surrender. Notice what I just said. Heartfelt surrender, which included confessing and subsequently giving up their sins and rebellion against His ways. Well, how do you give up sins that you've cherished? What are the things that are taking you down? And do you focus on those things and then get discouraged and overwhelmed? The focus is not on the sin. I think the focus is on Christ's righteousness.
Amen.
That gives us victory over the sin. Are you with me? Well, we're going to look at that. Is that what Isaiah teaches? What we're going to see. And so Isaiah saw clearly that departure from God was the real cause of Israel's political calamities. That turn to God was the only permanent remedy. This is the same situation for today. And so I'm going to go through 5 points that are applicable from what Isaiah is saying to us for us today. Amos and Hosea had been giving messages to northern Israel concerning people's destitute spiritual condition, and Isaiah saw the same condition prevailing in Judah. And it was during the time of the joint reign between Uzziah, that was smitten with leprosy, and Jotham, his son, that Isaiah began his prophetic ministry. The people in Israel would carry out licentious. What do I mean by that word? What is licentious? You know what that means? Anybody know what that means?
It means taking things further than you should because you think you have that right.
Oh, okay. Well, that's another little twist on it. That's okay. Good. I'm glad you answered. Well, this is what I find in the Greek carry over into the English in the aspect of biblical, what this would mean. It means lacking moral restraints. Now, would that be in harmony? Lacking moral restraints. What would that mean? What's a moral restraint? Who sets up morality?
God.
I'm going to keep you folks awake. You know that? When I leave here, you may not want me to come back. Okay? But I want you to think about what the Bible is telling us in a practical application. If it's not doing any good for your life or my life, there's a lot of things I wish I could undo in my life. There's things in Vietnam I wish I'd never made a decision to do that I did. But it led me to do what I'm doing today. Never planned to be a preacher.
Amen.
But what is it that is a moral restraint? Who sets up the moral code? Maybe
God.
God, right? You had the Ten Commandments, and then you had the laws of Moses. One was in the Ark of the Covenant, one was set at the side of the Ark, right? What was done away with on the cross? The Mosaic Law, right? Seventh-day Sabbath is not part of the Mosaic Law. The Ten Commandments are laws of God. And so what Isaiah is trying to tell us, the situation in Judah, God's people, with the death of King Uzziah, there are 4 points or lessons. I said 5. There's 5 woes. There's 7 woes actually going to be broken down. Number 1, King Uzziah's reign was long and prosperous, but with this prosperity he became proud and self-absorbed. What was the problem? He was successful. God bless. But because of that, he became proud and self-absorbent. What does that mean? What is it to be self-absorbent?
You think about yourself only.
Everything falls on what you can accomplish, what you can do, right?
Right.
How about humanism? What is humanism? What is that? What is that as opposed to what God dictates as His guidance in His law? Humanism is, within man, is the ability to solve his problems, right? I mean, that's a real simple definition, but that means man has the ability to solve. Can man solve all the problems of the world today? We just keep digging them deeper, don't we? And now we have really a Marxist ideology that's trying to influence and take over our nation. And what is Karl Marx? He's an atheist. So there's no trust in God there. And there's definitely a war on Christianity. Christians as a total. And so what we're seeing, what took place, 2 Chronicles 26:16 tells us, he attempted to offer incense in the temple, but did not have the priestly credentials of being a descendant of Aaron. And thus was stopped by the priest. He became angry, resulting in the Lord striking him with leprosy, which excluded him from the house of the Lord. It is ironic that Isaiah saw a vision of the pure, immortal, divine king in his house temple, and the very year the impure human king died. Rather interesting. Number 2. There is a striking contrast between Uzziah and Isaiah. Uzziah reached for holiness presumptuously for the wrong reason, pride, and instead became ritually impure so that he was cut off from holiness. Real lesson there. Isaiah, on the other hand, allowed God's holiness to reach him. He humbly admitted his weakness and yearned for moral purity in Isaiah 6:5-7. Luke 18 tells the story of the basis of true spiritual purity. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. What does abased mean?
Humble down.
Come on.
Way down. Humble.
And if I read things, I can put you to sleep, but we're going to go beyond that. This is just the overview now, okay?
Put down or humble down.
Abased.
Put down, really low.
Really low.
Yeah.
All right, number 3. There is a striking similarity. spiritually speaking, between Uzziah's leprosy, or leprous body, and the moral condition of the people of the kingdom. You know, after 40-some years, as a pastor, for somebody that is not a people person, for somebody who would never have chosen the ministry except that my life was spared, I look at our church over those years, even my own life, and things that have brought me low and dropped me to my knees in my ministry and so forth, in my life, my family. And to see the church, and to see the attitude and the spiritual condition of people, those that were exalted as leaders, and to see them fade away. Those that coming from real bad backgrounds and so on, but really got a grasp of the Lord and how God used them. What is the message for us? God accepts us when we give our all to Him. And it doesn't matter what walk of life. It's the fact God has a love, and He wants to see each and every one of us saved. We have to be responsible. And sometimes that takes, remember the river of grace? Remember Ezekiel 47?
Yeah.
Gets at the ankles, changes our direction, remember? Gets at the knees, changes who we bow down to. Hits at the loins, Peter said, gird up the loins of your mind. The creative aspect of human beings, male and female, can create new life. Your mind, your thought process. And then it's a river you cannot swim across. Verse 5. In other words, totally sustained by God's grace. This is what sanctification is all about. Changing our direction, who we bow, how we think, and eventually totally relying upon the grace of God. And that's how we grow. Because out of His side came blood and water. Remember in John 19? Justification, sanctification are together. You cannot separate them. You're justified by the blood. You're entitled to the kingdom because you accepted that blood. But that blood acceptance, that justification means that you're going to grow in your walk with God that changes your life. Pretty simple, right? But when I gave it, there weren't any of you, not many of you, that ever even saw that. And I gleaned it from scholars that I'd studied from. Okay? And so God wants us all to grow. Okay, number 4. This is the last one on this. The death of Uzziah was about 740 BC. Marks a major crisis in the leadership of God's people. When people have an absolute ruler that they rely upon instead of God, they are vulnerable to chaos and disorder because of transition and earthly leadership. The changes that take place. The Assyrian king had ascended the throne of Assyria and immediately went on an aggressive path to make his nation an invincible superpower, threaten the independent existence of all nations in the Near East. It was during this time God showed the prophet Isaiah that He was still in control. So remember that. No matter what you're watching today, the attack and the evil, God is still in control.
Amen. Amen.
And so with that, the transcendent, by the way, there's another big word. What does that mean? Transcendent. The transcendent holiness of God. I won't put Walter on the spot, but he's sitting there thinking, so his wheels are turning, I can see it. What does it mean? It means beyond the limits of the apparent world. Transcendent. Beyond the appearance of the apparent world, the holiness of God. Revealed in Isaiah's vision is a basic aspect of Isaiah's message. This is revealed in Isaiah 6, 1 through 4. And God gives His people who repent and shun evil a holiness that comes with a total submission and devotion to the Lord. One's faith is totally submitted to God. And this is what God is seeking from His people. It's not really, it's a misnomer to always put a tag on 144,000, in my opinion. Because that is not where our focus should be. How righteous we are. I had an individual a number of years ago, he was from the Davidian movement. Any of you heard of the Davidians? You know who they are? He said he hadn't sinned in 3 months.
Oh dear.
Hadn't sinned in 3 months. He was part of the 144,000. You know, and I thought, well, first of all, he's judging himself, and a sinful individual can't judge a sinful individual. We can't do that. We don't have the ability. I'm going to show you why from Isaiah that statement would be revealed, because Isaiah was a righteous man, and remember he said he was a man of unclean lips. What took place to bring him to that point? And so when this individual said this to me, and I thought, that's rather interesting. So that means that you can judge everybody else. Well, who's going to judge whether you're saved or lost? Who's going to do that? Why does he have the right to do that?
The Creator.
He created us, right? Did he die for us?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did he live a life like we lived and go through all the trials that we go through?
Yes.
Yeah. And more. And he was a righteous, he was God. He created us, right? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Like the Father, Son. Jesus went through the crucifixion. So he has the right to judge whether you and I are saved or lost. So now if somebody comes to you and say, I'm righteous and I haven't sinned for over 3 months, 3.5 months, I haven't sinned, I flee. Okay? Because who really knows what true perfection is? And my concept now of perfection, it is a total devotion, total submission to the Lord under God's grace, according to Ezekiel, the river of grace. You are immersed in a river you cannot swim across. There is no works that's going to get you across to the other side. It is by a submission to God and His power to transform, because you've opened your heart to Him. You've allowed His grace to fill you. Who you are is different than what the world has. And so there's a whole theology. I've written many papers on some of this. And so in Isaiah 5 we find the antithesis. You know what I mean by that? There's another fancy word. What's an antithesis? So I have your attention, you're ready to drive me out of here on a rail, huh? The direct opposite. Antithesis. The direct opposite of what God has. So God's way of holiness. Ahaz was a king about 735 BC and refused to seek any sign or counsel from God. Under the parable of a vineyard, God explains His people. Isaiah is at a time a prophet of doom, and at a time a prophet of hope. Self was at the center of Ahaz's thinking. If you compare 2 Kings 16, 15, 30, these different chapters, we have in Isaiah 5 as a parallel. So let's turn to Isaiah. Let's take a look and see chapter 5. See what he says. What I'd like you to do is pick it up here. Now I will sing to my beloved or well-beloved a song of beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved have the vineyard in a very truthful hill. I'm not going to read all this because this is not where the focus is, but I want you to think about what he's saying. When he goes through this vineyard, we have a parallel of this in Matthew. We have a parallel of this in Luke, and we have a parallel in Mark. Let's keep our finger here just for a moment in Isaiah. Now let's go back to Matthew. And let's take a look at what he's saying here. In Matthew, if you would look to the 21st chapter of Matthew. And drop down, if you would, to the 41st verse. They say unto him, he will visibly destroy those wicked, and let out, notice, and will let out his vineyard unto other herdsmen, which shall render him the fruits of their seasons. Jesus said unto them, Did ye ever read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, same has become the head of the corner? Therefore say I unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you, and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. And so when we look at the vineyard, and you can go on into Luke and to Mark, it has to do with the fruits or the offspring of what God wanted. But this vineyard, what he is saying here, is going to be taken from them. Verse 5, back in chapter 5 of Isaiah. Actually, verse 4. And what could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. And now go to, I tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden under down. Verse 7. For the vineyard of the Lord of the hosts, the Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth. Remember when that term is used for God, Yahweh Sabaoth? God is speaking from the host of heaven, from many, but to a few that are discouraged. And he's trying to tell them, I'm the host of the universe. I'm behind you. So the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah, his pleasant plan. And he looked for judgment, and behold, oppressed, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. Woe! Notice verse 8. Woe unto them that join house to house, and lay field to field, till there is no more place. So we're going to start the woes. We're going to break them down. The first woe. And because of time, I'm going to just expedite some of this. The lesson for us comes in the message of 6 woes. These woes are the most important characteristics of the evil of that age. So this is a lesson for us. We look back, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. So we look back at the lessons that God is giving to his people in the time of Isaiah. Woe unto you. So what is it? Woe to them that join house to house. This woe represents sins of covetousness and greed based on a historical understanding of how people lived during that time. Instead of a large number of small landholders, there had been evolved through time wealthy proprietors with poverty-stricken landless laborers. The year of Jubilee had been established to guard against this taking place. In other words, when everyone had their land, there were those that were better businessmen, women, and were able to take others. And finally, the others became subservients. So what is the land of Jubilee, or the time? What would this do for the people? It would redistribute. And there was another thing that they had also to guard against this. And this, it was the inheritance of heiresses. And found in Numbers 27. This also guarded against a few controlling everything. Well, see, with Marxism, they say everybody has part of the puzzle, but that's not true. 5 or 10 or 5 or 7% control everything, and the rest work for them, really. And so this goes against, woe to them that join house to house. Verse 11, woe unto them that follow strong drink. This reflects on the sin of drunkenness and intemperance. Revelation 14:12 and 17:1. Nations drunk with false philosophy in the spiritual connotation is the spiritual connotation of drunkenness. You take in a false religion, a false philosophy and theology, and that dictates how you live your life. What it does, if it's false, in the context of what God has, that means you're not following God. You're following something wrong, something else. Who ultimately would you be following? So there's only 2, right? The great controversy between Christ and Satan. And so it is important that we understand. So what does he say here? Drunkenness. Nations drunk with false philosophy is a spiritual connotation. Chapter 5, verse 13. By persisting in ways which were against the Lord's teaching, God's people were taken captive by the enemy and evil because they lacked the knowledge of righteousness and were void of true spiritual understanding. Friends, if you get anything out of a sermon, I could ask you next week, and I've mentioned this before, what did I say last week? Now, most of you, because I've gone over it, the river of grace, you remember me giving that sermon, but I've gone over it. But if you have it to study on your own, to take the word and digest it, and you don't do it, what good is it to you? We have got to absorb the word to build our characters.
Yes.
I listened to sermons that there were 3 professors that one of them wasn't really a professor that I had directly. He gave a series of meetings on Ezekiel. That was Leslie Hardy in camp meeting years ago back in the 1980s. But there was Gerhard Hausel, Leslie Hardy. There were certain professors that I had in the seminary that I had their material and I would go over because they had insights and the connectors of things that I saw. There were others that I threw their stuff after I took the class in the trash. I never took it with me again because it didn't fill my spiritual soul. If something spiritually fills you and fortifies you, it's something that you need to meditate and absorb. And that's what Ezekiel is trying to tell us. Woe unto this group, woe unto that group. And then he keeps going and he says, by persistently, woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity. Now that's an interesting phrase or expression, cords of vanity. Do you know what kind of cords he's talking about there? That's in verse 18. Cords of vanity. What is vanity? Vanity is pride, arrogance, self.
Confidence in
Confidence.
yourself, not in God.
Okay, but now this is cords. And that's an interesting word there. Because what that is, the word iniquity is used here meaning to bend towards self. Remember it talks about sin and iniquity. I've mentioned this before. Sin, and Jesus says how you think. If you look at this, well, like we know with David. He looked at another man's wife, and in his mind, he lusted after her, right?
Right.
So in that context, he's committed sin in his thoughts. But then what did he do? He took her. That's an extension of sin. Iniquity is in the heart. The extension is the outcarrying of what that happens. Sin and iniquity are sin. One is a carrying out, and it's very obvious. I mean, I don't know what you people are thinking, but if you carry it out in an action, that's pretty obvious, right? So he looked at so what we have here, cords of vanity. The word cord is referred to a cart rope. A cart rope, which connotes a thicker substance. Now, catch what he's saying here. A cart rope, thicker substance of vanity. Used in this context, it represents an advanced stage of rebelliousness in which wicked and wickedness are abound or are abounding. By persisting in evil and rebellious action against the Lord, the wicked are bound in their sins with bonds, cords, cart ropes that are seemingly impossible to break.
Amen.
See the difference? As they partake and they continue, they fortify this action. And then verse 20. Woe to them that call evil good and good evil. Do you remember Vice President wife, several years back, Pence, his wife? She was up and they were talking about, they were interviewing him and she was looking at what was happening and she used that.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you remember that,
Yes.
that interview. Those that basically call evil good and good evil.
Yeah.
Here we read of people who do not want to acknowledge evil and sin for what they are, but they want to pervert or deviate from the proper or right course of action and call it good. Evil are the human motives that are adulterated with selfishness, greed, and vengeance. Spiritual darkness and evil notions are the norm for a society that rejects God's righteousness. His righteous ways are revealed through the Word. My wife and I were visiting California. Actually, it was a relative of my wife's. It wasn't a cousin, it was her husband. I don't know that I gave this illustration before. If I did, forgive me. But it really it really impacted me. I've never met this man before. And we came in, and it was at a church service. So it was Sabbath, church, go there to worship. I don't want to get into politics. You know, I mentioned there was an executive officer that said in the wardroom, that's where the officers eat aboard a Navy ship, you don't talk politics, you don't talk religion. Two quickest ways to make an enemy. Politics, that's what this executive officer, I was a young officer, and I'm listening to this, and I thought, well, that sounds like good advice to me. So we went to this thing, we were having, the sermon was finished, and we were having some fellowship. Jill was getting reacquainted with her cousin, and she has 41st cousins, I believe. And I don't think she could name them all, maybe she could. So I'm sitting across from the husband, and he and I are dialoguing, and then all of a sudden, he comes out with this. We got to figure out a way to get rid of Trump. This guy doesn't know me. I mean, he doesn't know me. And he's telling me this right off the bat. I don't know this man. I just met him. And I thought, what? And so I looked at him and I said, I was trying to be a pastor and a chaplain in a discreet way. But I guess I wasn't very discreet. I said, you know, I don't understand how people could put people in office that want to do late-term abortion and kill babies out of the womb, like the governor there in Virginia. After the baby's born, let him die on the table. That's what he signed into law. I said, how could that be Christianity? Now, did I make a friend? Do you know what he said to me? I'm the head deacon, I'm on duty. And got up and walked away.
Oh, wow.
So, I guess my point is this. If our focus is on this world, and this is where I'm the first one, because of this Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and I got into an altercation with one of Jill's kids, and I feel so bad about this. Because I said, this is not where I'm at. And I don't even want to discuss politics. I mean, I try to avoid it now. But as Christians, we're going to be faced with decisions. And what God is saying to them, woe to them that call evil good and good evil. And then he goes on and he says, woe to them, verse 21, that are wise in their own eyes. These are the ones whose human reason, vain imaginations, and vaunted, boasted wisdom in their subjective. By the way, what do I mean by subjective? Within their person, their own ideas. It's in their own mind. This subjective ideology to evaluate what is good or evil. In other words, humanism. You're letting human values and norms determine what is righteous and what is unrighteous. And as Christians, we can't do that.
Amen.
Because, you know, what would be a sin to me may not be a sin to you. Well, how can I make that statement? Because if it becomes an obsession with me, but it's not with you, then, you know, in other words, there's certain things that are not necessarily wrong or bad, but if they become obsessive, that they control us, then it's a sin, because it's destroying us. Now, you'd mentioned, Walter, about the health message earlier in the Sabbath school. Well, you know, we all have issues. Eating is an issue, what we eat, whether it's too much or the wrong kind of food. And so, I mean, that's just an example. I'm not picking on anybody. That's just the way it is. So what we're looking at in the context of this is that we cannot allow humanism, human ideology, to determine what is righteous and what is unrighteous. It has to come through the Word of God. And so, let me go ahead and finish a couple of these because my real focus, and I'm not used to having church after 12:30, but bear with me. I want to finish up the key that I have this morning. That's in chapter 6. Woe to them that are wise in their own eyes. Then verse 22, woe to them that are mighty to drink wine. This woe is contrasted to the drinkers of wine in verses 11 and 12. It traces the relationship between drink and injustice mentioned in verse 23 as resulting from its use. These individuals are willing to exonerate the most wicked of men for the sake of material gain. Who would these be? These would be the politicians, these would be the judges. These are leaders and judges impaired by strong drink, bribery, and human reason as opposed to the law of God. Are any of our politicians on the kickbacks, under the table kickbacks?
No way.
Yeah.
No.
Oh,
No.
no, why would it happen? Huh? Well, you know, when we look at what the Bible tells us, we know that this is going to be one of the things. Woe to them. Then it goes on, because of time. We see by the aforementioned and unrighteous depicted by woes what brings about God's anger or righteous indignation. I like that better than judgment. Righteous indignation. Because judgment has, that we're setting ourselves up to determine. But God has His laws, and they go against His laws. He's indignant. Because He's established a system that would keep us in a much better harmony. And we go against it. And so, with this picture, with pending doom, was going to be carried out by the Assyrian army. And so that's what took place. Now, in Isaiah 6, we find woe. I should have mentioned, what is a woe? I should have done this right at the start. What is a woe? What's a woe in God's eyes? Hey, I'm telling you, you may not want me back. I'm going to give you a test. What is a woe?
It's like the wrath of God.
It's a test.
It's a test. Let me throw this out at you, see if you agree or not, okay? Woe means, biblically speaking, woe means a state of hopelessness when confronted by evil in this world. A state of our hopelessness. By the way, why would that be? Because we have the propensity to sin. We have sinned. It's inherent in who we are. We are born into sin because of our forefathers. And so there's a hopelessness on our scale of trying to, remember the river race, swim into the, to cleanse ourselves. Can we cleanse ourselves?
No.
It is by God's grace. So it's a state, woe, of the hopelessness when they have evil for good and good for evil. The state of condition, because they are blind, they are ignorant about the will and the way of God. And so in Isaiah chapter 6, what the prophet sees, and this is the whole key of my sermon this morning, God designed that Isaiah should catch a wider vision. This is why I say to set ones up as the judgment from what we have in chapter 6, I think, is the wrong focus. We need to keep that in mind, but I think it's the wrong focus, and I'm going to show you why. Isaiah should catch a wider vision of the sacred precincts of the temple than merely what he saw taking place about him. The lesson for us today is that in spite of all that might be happening in our nation or world, God is still supreme upon His throne and in control of the affairs of the earth. So now notice, in chapter 6, in 6th chapter, expands upon the manifestation of divine glory. Catch that word, divine glory. The prophet, as mentioned, was to have a wider vision of sacredness and righteousness. It needed to be on holy ground. After this spiritual renewing experience, Isaiah was tasked with arousing the people from their spiritual lethargy. He saw the condition, just like Jeremiah. They were spiritually, and Ezekiel, they were spiritually dead. They were a valley full of dry bones. Very dry, very dead spiritually, is what all the prophets saw with the people. This would be discouraging. But here was a man of God, and he saw their lethargy, indifference, or they're absolutely changing what was evil and what was good in their eyes. And so he goes on. So he was getting discouraged. So what did the Lord do? After this spiritual renewing, verse 1, his train was filled. Let's take a look at a couple of things in chapter 6, just to lead into this, and I'm at the foreclosure. In the year, chapter 6, verse 1, in the year of King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon where? A throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Well, what is the train? The train of the skirt there reflects on the robe of righteousness. His righteousness filled the temple. And then what? And above it stood the seraphims. Remember, these were 6 wing angels. Originally there were cherubims, 4 wings. Seraphims, 6 wings. Notice what it says. Had 6 wings. With twain covered his face, with twain covered his feet. So we have adoration, humiliation, his feet, and flying. Speed of service, or to serve. Verse 3, and one cried unto another, and said, Holy, holy, holy. What does that mean? 3 times, repeated.
That means it's a fact.
Well, let me give you a clue. There's several interpretations of that, and this is just to give you some insight to apply. Notice then, what does he say next? Is the Lord of hosts, remember Yahweh Sabaoth, and the Lord and the whole earth is full of, notice his what? His glory, light, love, and hope. If you want to summarize glory, light, love, and hope. Holy, 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 possibly, but then said I, woe is me. What do we say with woe? Means the state of hopelessness when confronted by evil in this world. So he is seeing a people and a world of evil, and now he's got a vision of God, and woe is me. So what else? For I am undone because I am a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Now I want you to think about this. This is a righteous man. This is a man that was chosen by God to be a prophet. But his understanding of righteousness was based on a world that he lived in, a world of sin. This righteous man now was taken to heaven and saw righteousness in the realm of a sinless area where there was no defilement. He saw God in his full glory in a out of this world where there was no sin. And so what happened? What did he do? When he saw this, I am a man of unclean lips. And then you'll notice, verse 6, then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. What is the altar that it's taken from represent? This is where the offering was burnt. This is representing, spiritually speaking, Christ. He's taking the purging of Christ on the altar for our sins and touching his lips. You see the imagery there? So if you have Christ's righteousness and he's covering your sins, touching your lips, what would take place? A purification. That's what he's saying. And then notice what else. And he goes on. And he laid it upon my mouth, verse 7, and lo, this had touched my lips, and mine iniquity, what is that? Bending toward self. Sin is what? Is taken away, and thy sin purged. Would this be good news to an individual? Would this be good news to you? You're in a world of sin. You see all the sin around you. You now see what real glory is. Righteousness in the heavenly setting, what true righteousness is. And you saw yourself as unclean. Would this be humility? Absolutely. You would realize there is nothing that I can offer God. I am a sinner. I'm a man of unclean lips. And so God says, look, the seraphim, They were the guardian angels. Remember, their wings touched top and bottom. Wheels within the wheels, verse 16 of Ezekiel 1. The appearance of wheels within the wheels. The inner workings of God to save us. Through the Holy Spirit, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, other angelic beings, other human beings, whatever it is, to save us. Working. And so what he has here, he goes on, and he said, verse 8, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then Isaiah said, here am I, send me. And he said, go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of the people fat, make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart. Convert and be healed. So notice, and I'm going to just read a couple of these things. Above it stood a seraphim. I'm going to just break this down. I have it just written out. These were angels on the Ark of the Covenant. Had 6 wings. 2 covered their face, adoration. 2 covered their feet, humiliation. 2 could fly, revealing the urgency of service, the speed of carrying out the Lord's mission and work. Holy, holy, holy could mean separate, apart from, or distinct as derived from the Hebrew word holy. So this is where it breaks down. This is an answer to Donna back there. There are those who believe this refers to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That could be a way of looking at it. There are also, holiness reveals perfect purity, which in turn reveals God's love, light, and goodness, or righteousness. Love, light, and righteousness. So whether it's the Father, Son, or Holy Spirit, there's 2 takes on this that I've read in my research. So woe is me, for I am undone. In the 7th and final woe, we see a contrast from the first 6 woes. The first 6 woes describe sin, but then the prophet saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, which gave him a clear vision of true righteousness and divine grace. Light, love, and hope, divine grace. When Isaiah saw the Lord, it was more than his form or appearance. He saw the Lord's holiness, his character, which caused him to cry out, I am unclean. Then flew. And I broke this down. What was undone, that which was undone, and the unworthiness that allowed a great vision to take place, transformed Isaiah. A righteous man, and yet not truly. And so this is my challenge for all of us. God does not want us to just focus on trying to cleanse sins. God wants us to focus on his righteousness, which will bring about a cleansing of our sins. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
Yep.
Because if we focus on all the negative, all our shortcomings and our faults, we're going to be overwhelmed. We're going to be discouraged. There are so many, over the 40-some years that I've met, that have, quote, and as a chaplain, so this is not just Seventh-day Adventists, I'm not just picking on Seventh-day Adventists, that say they're Christians and they're miserable. They cannot improve themselves enough to be good enough. And so they're not happy. And they bring this happiness, they reveal it in their characters, in what how they represent Christ. And how can you go out and win souls under doom and gloom?
Yeah.
And so what God wants us to focus on is what he wanted Isaiah, to see what true righteousness is, to make a difference. And yet even then, we fail. Because we can't 100% of the time keep our focus on Jesus. We take our eyes off, and that's when we fail. But this is where God's justification comes in. We're justified by the blood. He covers our sins. Now, if you fall, like I fell, and get in an argument politically with this husband of one of Jill's cousins, or with one of Jill's children over what's happening with the firebombing of our cities and so on, I failed there. But it was a lesson for me that I not do it again. That we have a victory. And so the focus is on Christ's righteousness and what he has done for us. That we grow in his grace. That we can not be a bog. Remember the marshland? Same river. Remember in Ezekiel 47? Same river. What's the difference between the river that's flowing and the marshland? The marshland is what? Dead, stagnant, because it's not allowing God's grace to flow through them. And so if we have that as our Christian experience, we're going to die. If we don't have that flowing experience with God's grace, we will spiritually die. So that's a struggle we all have. I have it. But God doesn't want us to focus on that. He wants us to focus on the victory that is here.
Amen.
Out of his side. All right. I have really held you folks over. But it's your fault. You just keep singing too many songs.
I know, we just came to praise